Hello, my name's Heather Powell. I head up the property and construction team here at Blick Rothenberg, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Moan from Devonshire Solicitors. We're going to talk about the issues that investors in commercial property should consider before buying. And Dan's a real expert in this area because he is head of the commercial property team at Devonshire's. So Dan, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Can I kick off with one question?
Yes, of course, Heather.
Ideal client, when they walk in the door and say to you, I'm thinking of buying, or I'm buying some real estate in the UK, what is the first thing you would like them to consider?
What I'd like them to do is have paused beforehand as to what they're about to buy, consider what the options are, and kind of set them out on, in the old vernacular, on the back of a beer mat or something equivalent, but to actually put it down on a piece of paper to work out where the source of funding's coming from, what the deal looks like, what the risk profile is to them, and then to have sought advice or guidance from an array of other professionals on the way through so that they can optimise the structuring of the purchase and also think about their exit strategy on the way through, because buying something is always exciting. How you look after it in the meantime, and better still improve it on the way through, is really key. But ultimately, almost everyone as an investor there is doing it in order to raise further funds, and so thinking about that exit strategy from the outset is key. So whether or not they're buying it in a personal capacity, whether or not they're buying it in a corporate wrapper, and linked to all of that, of course, is the tax angle.
Of course, which we find incredibly interesting, and that is driven by what they want to do with it. What are their plans? Are they going to occupy it themselves, run a business from it? Are they actually going to let it and run it as an investment property? Or is it a trade play? Are they going to buy it, improve it, as you say, really add some value, perhaps re-gear the tenancies, and then get out? And that changes the whole tax picture, and thus the cash flows for them hugely. So we're looking for investors who've thought about what their strategy is, and if they're actually thinking, I've got some capital I want to invest, take advice so they understand what the angles are. Yeah,
so the advice at the right stage is the key point, because once you've kind of jumped in with 2 feet, it's quite hard to row back from a position.
Exactly.
Equally with a counterparty, in this instance the seller, they may have different commercial drivers to the buyer and different tax positions that need to be assessed, and or when they need to realise funds as well. And so all of those different layers should form part of the transactional piece, and with the support of professionals for that purchaser, is they can work out the best way to do it on the way through. So that's not necessarily being lastminute.com in terms of arrival with kind of, please do this deal, can I have it done by next week? Because to outsource some of the risk there, searches and other bits and pieces all take some time, but assessing what's the best wrapper or purchase entity is a key point, and that's going to take more than 5 minutes on the way through.
Exactly.
So involving the right people at the right time is key.
So having identified the property, do you buy the company? Do you buy the asset? And that's a big decision that people don't often consider. And I'll get calls and someone will say, I'm going to buy this company, Heather, because I'm going to save 5% stamp duty land tax. It's only 0.5% for the shares, or if it's owned in an overseas company, no stamp duty on the shares. And why would I do anything else? But that's actually a really big decision, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a big decision, and I think you need to be beware of the headlines on the way through. It's easy to see that 5% saving on the way through.
If it's 20 million purchase price, it's a big saving.
However, there are obviously some foibles within that corporate wrapper, as what the tax position is with that company, whether or not they've got any potential liabilities.
Exactly.
But I'm conscious I'm treading on your toes there. So perhaps you could talk me through, for the benefit of everyone else, what your kind of 3 or 4 key points would be to guide someone.
I think when you're buying a property company, the key things we find, undertake due diligence, which is a term that people may or may not have heard, but we go and dive into those companies' records. And in a property company which hasn't traded, hadn't had any other trading activities, the key issues that we always recommend people should look at and get their head around is, has it complied with the VAT registration? Because if it's an office block, a logistics unit, factory unit, it's probably registered for VAT, not always, but probably. Have they actually complied with all the VAT rules? Have they filed promptly? Have they thought about things like the capital goods scheme? So we would always recommend getting a VAT consultant to go through that history. Assuming the VAT is right, construction industry scheme. Horrible scheme. Basically, the Treasury have not trusted the construction industry to comply with their with their tax requirements and tax filings for over 20 years. So we've got a scheme which says if a company is doing major works on its building, it needs to register with under the CIS scheme with HMRC. And every time it makes a payment for construction services, it needs to check that the person they're paying are registered and compliant as far as HMRC are concerned. And if they're not, they need to make deductions at source from the money being paid across. That is so often missed by property investors, and it's the company that's responsible, not the seller of the shares. So that can have big ramifications for a buyer of a company if that's not being complied with correctly.
So essentially the buyer would be buying that liability on the way through?
Exactly, exactly. So we've got VAT, CIS, stamp duty, land tax. Have they actually paid the correct stamp duty, land tax when they acquired the property? If there have been any maybe intergroup transfers, leasing transactions, have all of the rules been complied with there? So look at that very carefully. And last but not least, corporation tax. A company, it doesn't matter whether it's a UK company or an overseas company, that owns a property in the UK has to file a corporation tax return every year. Has that been done? And actually, has it been prepared correctly? Have the interest deduction rules being complied with? Have any transfer pricing rules on intercompany debt being complied with? So, and again, as you highlighted, if it's not been done properly, that liability transfers to the buyer. And then last but not least, which is more of an accounting issue than a tax issue, if a property goes up in value, there's a tax liability that the company will crystallise when it sells that property. And the accountants will make a provision for for deferred tax, so tax that will be paid but it's deferred into the future on that gain. Now, if that's not on the balance sheet of the company, the buyer is buying, the buyer of the shares is taking on that liability, and it can be substantial depending on how long that company's been in existence. So again, checking that, quantifying it, and making sure that that is reflected in the share price, because the price for the shares is not going to be, except in very unusual circumstances, the value of the property. Hopefully that makes sense, Dan.
Yeah, so all of that makes sense, and there are obviously a lot of different layers there on the way through, but from a purchase perspective, they've got their 2-3 page heads of terms that they're hoping summarises the deal and covers everything. There's a little bit more due diligence required on the way through.
Well, there's a lot more that you need to do and your team do, isn't there?
Well, there's plenty to be done on the way through. So obviously from our perspective, we use the heads of terms as the framework to start things off. And a good set of heads of terms aren't just purchaser-seller price. There's a whole lot more detail required. You need to consider what's happening if you're buying it for an investment purposes, what's happening with the income stream, do you have any voids in terms of the space, and or whether or not there are rent frees from some of the occupiers. Is there an obligation on the seller to top those sums up? And if so, how does that link in with service charge or other liabilities under those leases? Attached to that also is, whether or not there's, normally more so where there's a kind of development angle, but are there any ancillary agreements to kind of top up the purchase price because they've reached a deal based on a set number, but someone has an element of hope value of being able to develop it, convert it to residential or otherwise. And then we get joys of things like overage agreements coming in where there's a perception of a sharing of any uplift that's acquired on the way through. All of those sound great, but the devil's in the detail and often in the maths as to how the overage is calculated on the way through. So for us, it's really important to see what's been set out, the heads of terms that we've agreed along with the client and with the all of their other professional advisors as to what the entity is going to be to acquire it. And then we get into the nitty-gritty of the kind of purchasing and the due diligence of the property.
So the heads of terms, it's a really critical document, isn't it? But it's not one actually to be rushed into. It's, we want to buy, maybe an expression of intent to the seller, but the heads of terms, you really need to think about what we're putting in there, don't we?
Yeah, the heads of terms are not usually legally binding unless we've got confidentiality clauses added in, or whether or not there's kind of agreement to pay costs, etc., attached to it, because perhaps one person's nipped in front of the rest of the market and agreed to buy it quickly, and so someone's agreed a particular set of terms on the way through, and then we move into the realms of exclusivity agreements, but I think we'll park that for the time being. But the heads of terms are key because they set out the expectations of both parties, and the closer you hold to those, the easier it is to get the transaction done in the right way that works ultimately for both parties. Because whilst you might have a forced seller, in reality, no one wants to find out that they've done a bad deal and for it to be shouted about in the press. Everyone wants to know that a good deal's been done, where there's some foibles, that someone's found a practical solution to them, whether they be from an accounting point of view, and a tax anomaly that's been discovered in your due diligence, or alternatively, there's a title defect and we rely on insurance, or we work out that perhaps something's not enforceable on the way through. So from your perspective, what else would you like to see from an accounting perspective to being considered in heads of terms?
Capital allowances is the big one, because it's so easy. So often we see a line that just say nil value, particularly where there's a property purchase rather than an SPV. But if it's an SPV, have the capital allowances all being claimed, have proper reports being done. And they can make a big difference to a company's cash flow in terms of and so when you look at the return on the investment over the first 5 years, if you can maximise that deduction for the plant and machinery, integral features, it actually maximising your cash, you're minimising your tax liabilities and maximising the cash retained by the business, can make a big difference to the affordability of any enhancements that you want to do. And
True.
We find that it's something that's a buyer often doesn't even think about. They just assume that it's an automatic deduction if they think about it at all. Do you have lots of conversations about capital allowances?
So it comes up in the rounds with people, less so at heads of terms basis, but once you've undertaken some of the other due diligence, so the joys that are replies to pre-contract inquiries, and you have various questions that kind of at least pull out some of that information, whether or not there are any capital allowances, what the VAT position is, etc. And from that, you can make an assessment. The other bit is in my experience, is to also consider the nature of the seller on the way through, as to whether or not they could in fact have claimed capital allowances. And if you know that they can't and they've undertaken some significant refurbishment, then there's potentially a significant uplift to the purchaser on the way through.
Exactly.
And so it's again, that's part of that wonderful joy of due diligence of working your way through the minefield that is the property transaction in order to do it in the most efficient way in order to optimise.
It's keeping doors open, I think, with something like that, isn't it? So making sure that from day one, when you actually own the company, the property, you have the options to, if allowances haven't been claimed, to get into some capital allowances consultants to quantify that claim so it can be made on a going forward. But if you close the doors in the contract, you can do as much work as you like, you're not going to get the deduction, are you?
True, and that's the way in which kind of accountants and lawyers work together quite well along with other professional advisors, is because you can draft the contract to leave open that door. So it may be that your capital allowance, the purchaser's capital allowance expert can't form their opinion within the timescale for the transaction.
Very unlikely, in my opinion.
True, but I didn't want to do them a disservice on the way through. But equally, by buying in a provision that for example, the seller's professional advisors will help the capital allowance advisor and or the buyer effectively on the way through and make records available, then that can be done
that's
in
my
a full
dream. Does that happen very often in your experience?
I'd love to promise it happens all the time, but no, it's down to the negotiation and awareness of the position of the parties.
Exactly.
sometimes if it costs the seller nothing to give it up, then actually there might be a trade-off going on somewhere else
exactly.
on the
Enhance
contract.
the price, or it just facilitates everything, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And deals aren't moving, well, at least in my experience, that quickly at the moment. So anything that you can help facilitate, make it a little bit easier for both parties, has got to help us to get to the end of the line on a transaction, hasn't it?
Yeah, and it's that engagement for both parties that's key. We come back to have they made a good bargain on the way through.
Yeah.
So from our perspective, we then kind of get into the next level of due diligence. So assuming we've bought an office block, for example, with half a dozen tenants, then obviously there's a due diligence on the each of the leases on the way through. There's the joys of looking through the service charge accounts with the managing agents to work out what the liabilities are and whether or not there's full recovery by virtue of reference to the lease on the way through.
Yeah, and I have had an instance recently with service charge caps, which came as a bit of a surprise to the buyer.
Okay. How did you negotiate that minefield?
Well, basically, they were there setting the leases, so they needed to factor that into their cash flow, which hadn't been part of their original investment appraisal.
Okay.
So there was a cost that was going to stay with the landlord, and some of those leases had another 5-6 years to run. So that was going to be an ongoing cost, depending on what was going through the service charge.
But that's another good example where added value is given by that level of due diligence that's been undertaken.
Oh, completely. And
so
it was highlighted by the lawyers that this cap's here, and then people can go and quantify that cost.
Yeah, and then the quantification then gets reflected in the purchase price as applicable, depending on whether or not the parties can agree a position accordingly. That's not always the case.
No. At least you go into the deal, if you still go into it eyes wide open.
A good set of professional advisors will help guide them through that process, but also give them practical solutions as to how to fix it, because it shouldn't just be a case of throwing the ball over the net and leaving it to say that's your problem. There's normally a way of finding a solution.
Exactly. Bringing our experience to bear and looking at previous transactions over, I daren't say how many years.
We'll all keep quiet about that. It's much easier that way.
Exactly. Changing the subject slightly, I've had clients who've had major issues where they've bought a property in an overseas company, which of course was a very common structure 20 years ago. And maybe the buyer is insistent you buy the company or not, nothing. But there are some pitfalls in buying a property in a UK property in an overseas company nowadays, aren't there?
Yes, there are. As part of kind of the wider control of flow of monies and ownership within the legislation, within the UK legislation, is there are controls now in place post some legislation in 2022, and that ultimately requires overseas entities to be registered at Companies House, and also the beneficial owners as well on the way through. So there's an extra level of transparency required, as well as kind of form filling, for want of a better phrase, on the way through.
Absolutely.
And the same applies whether or not you're buyer or seller in terms of the registration on the way through. And obviously the sanctions for not doing it are significant on the way
They are
through.
far more significant than the registration requirements for a UK company at the moment, although I think we're beginning to catch up on that. And the other, registering at Companies House, having to disclose who the ultimate beneficial owner, and that's a name and an address. It can be a correspondence as opposed to personal address, is then they're registered. And of course all of those details are shared with our tax authorities, so there's no hiding nowadays. But the other thing that my clients have found is debt, if they do want to go to market and get some borrowings, is more expensive, even if it is available.
Yeah, so we're having similar findings. We're finding that most lenders don't necessarily want to touch that overseas market. They'd like clearer transparency as to who's owning it, and then ultimately what the disposal strategy might be for the property as well. And so whilst not necessarily a red flag for things, it just reduces the pool of potential lenders in the market and changes the price point for it accordingly.
Absolutely. I think we've run out of time, Dan, but I just want to say a massive thank you for coming in. Hopefully our listeners have found that really interesting. I think we've covered the key points that we wanted to.
Thanks very much, Heather.
So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting. If you have any questions, want to discuss any of the points we've raised, please do reach out to your normal contact at Blick Rothenberg or to me. Look forward to hearing your views. Thank you.